Mark chapter 4. Turn in your Bibles there. Follow along. Mark chapter 4. And a brief parable here, one you're probably familiar with. Mark chapter 4, verses 26 through 29. We read that passage, and I'm not going to mention it again until the very, 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 very end. So don't think we're going to study this text. We're going to flip around actually and look at a couple of different passages, but we read that for a reason, but you won't know until we get to the very, very end. If you didn't pick up one of the handouts here, I hopefully you did get one. If you didn't, you can still get one before you leave. On the back side of this, I have two resources, two books that I would commend to you for your own edification. The one is the book by Rosaria Butterfield, The Gospel Comes with a House Key, and the other is called The Art of Neighboring. So I encourage you guys, if you would like to read those, certainly do that. I have a copy of the book to give away this evening, but I haven't figured out how I'm going to give it away yet. So if somebody's dying to get it, I would be glad to give it to you, or else you have to answer a question in the middle of the lesson tonight if I get to that. So anyhow, so that's those are the resources to kind of wrap this up. All right, so we have had 3 sessions that we've looked at on the topic of neighboring. We've talked about it from a couple of different angles. We looked a little bit at the parable of the Good Samaritan. We talked about neighboring in terms of loving your individual neighbors, but also loving your community. So loving your neighbors, but also loving your neighborhood and what that can look like, maybe slightly different ways. Last week we talked a little bit about how you can bring your neighbors to church and then also bring the church to your neighbors and what that might look like in a week in, week out fashion. So tonight we're going to wrap things up and bring it kind of to an end, and we're going to talk about where all of these other lessons, this sort of vision for neighboring, where it meets reality. And where it meets reality is this: loving your neighbor isn't always easy. And sometimes it can be very difficult. And living in a fallen world, we can bump into some challenges in doing this. And so tonight we're going to talk about 2 areas briefly. I'm going to talk about limitations and boundaries when it comes to loving your neighbors. All right? So what happens when you try to put this into practice and your neighbor just doesn't seem interested? Right? So you invite them to church and they never come. You mention God and they always change the subject. And they seem completely disinterested to any of the things that you're talking about. What do you do in that situation? If you stay in your yard, I'll stay in my yard, and there's a limit that's being placed on it. What do you do in that case? And then the other side we're going to talk about are boundaries. What if you say, I'm going to love my neighbor, and you start loving your neighbor, and you come to realize, oh, they responded well to this, but then the next thing you know, they seem to want more and more and more and more, and it doesn't seem to stop, and they're becoming kind of an emotional black hole, where they kind of suck you in, and it seems like, boy, how far do I go with this? Because they keep asking and asking and asking in that way. So limitations and boundaries, because it's not always that easy. All right, so let's talk about limitations. I have 2 or 3 that we have listed here we're going to look at. Again, this is somewhat topical, but we'll look at a few passages along the way. So what if your neighbor just simply doesn't want to be your friend? Right? You've tried the nice neighborly thing, you've taken the cookies, you've, kind of picked up the litter, the trash, whatever it takes, and they just don't want to be your friend. Now, let's brainstorm together for a second. What are some reasons that people might have for not wanting to be good neighbors or to be friends that way? What are some reasons? And whatever kind you can think. In fact, I've got a list. We're going to see if we can kick everything off the list here. And I have that one here. Excellent. All right. I also had on my list here that some people may be relationally full. They've already got friends. They don't see the need to add other friends, and that you're just one more person kind of that way. Some of it also may be different stages of life, right? So maybe, you're a person single and you got lots of free time on the weekends, and yet your neighbors have got little kids and they're, always busy with soccer and ballet or whatever else on the weekends, and so you try to show up and talk and they're out and you just don't seem to connect that way. It still catches me by surprise. It took me a long time to realize that our 6 kids are overwhelming to other people. Like, I'm so used to it, but I'm still caught by surprise by the fact that people are like, oh, you have so many kids, and I'm like, oh, that's right. That's weird to you. Like, that's normal to me, but that's weird to you. Okay, I forget that, right? And it's kind of off-putting, it seems. So.
Sometimes my kids overwhelm me.
Yeah, okay. Amen to that.
I know how
yeah.
neighbors feel with that.
Amen to that. And then the last one I wrote on here was they might be afraid of what you discover. That you discover they've got an adult son who's got, mental problems, and they feel maybe embarrassed by that. Or you might find out they're in counseling, and they want somebody to know that. Or that their marriage is not as great as maybe it perceives to be on the outside. Or maybe just that their house isn't as neat as yours is, and they feel self-conscious about that, right? So there can be lots of reasons that people maybe hold us off at a distance. And so my encouragement in this is, right at this point, is people are more complex on the inside than they appear on the outside. And it's very tempting sometimes when we're trying to do our evangelistic duty, right, our neighbor-loving duty, to assign motives. And I want to urge all of us to resist that urge. Because you had a bad encounter with this person, they may have had 45,000 other bad things going on that day, and it had nothing to do with you, right? But there's more going on than you realize. You mind get the door? Yeah, that'd be good. So Proverbs 18 verse 2 says, "A fool does not delight in understanding, but only in revealing his own opinions." My point being, let's not be the fool who thinks you know what's in somebody else's heart, unless you know for sure, but just saying, well, they don't love me because, or they won't be a friend because, right? Let's be careful not to do that. So what do you do in those issues, right? Regardless of the reason, what do you do in those situations, all right? Turn with me to Romans chapter 12. It's a very short verse, but there's 2 pieces of advice, I think, packed into this verse here. Romans chapter 12, and it's actually verse 12. The Apostle Paul's giving advice here on how the Christians should live out their faith. And notice he gives this guidance in verse 12. He says, rejoicing in hope, and then these 2 statements, persevering in tribulation, devoted to prayer. So what do you do when the neighbor doesn't want to be loved, right? Well, the advice here is simple. Be patient and be prayerful, right? It may not be a tribulation in terms of persecution, right? We recognize that. But it doesn't mean it's not making your Christian life a little harder or making things more difficult. And so to realize that part of the strategy, if I can use that term, is to love people over the long haul, through lots of seasons and lots of challenges, and to persevere through their ups and downs alongside them. And also to make it an issue of a sincere matter of prayer. He says to be patient in tribulation and be constant in prayer. Because you may think, man, I've tried cookies, I've tried flowers, I've tried conversations, I've tried compliments, and it may be that, well, not maybe, God can do in someone's heart what flowers and cookies can't ever accomplish. And so to make sure that this is also adjoined to a seeking the Lord on their behalf, to interceding for them and praying for Him, that God would do something in their life. Because you never know where that will intersect with where they are and what they need in that situation. So don't underestimate the impact of prayer. Another piece of advice I'd give you on this point is what do you do when things aren't going well, is to to fight against people pleasing. To fight against people pleasing. When somebody rejects us in the workplace, in the neighborhood, whatever it is, it's easy to take it personally and to see that as a referendum on our own value or our own worth. But we don't want to approach our neighbors just so we can feel accepted and we can feel better about ourselves. No, our desire is that we want to love them and we want to accept them even if they would maybe reject us. 1 Peter chapter 2, if you remember, we studied it earlier, not this year, last year. It says of Jesus, when he was reviled, what? He did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten. He but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. And so Jesus' love was not based on what he was receiving from us. Because what he was receiving from us was not good. And yet his love was poured out towards us. And so if your love for someone is based on their love for you in return, that's not really love. In other words, if you treat people as just like a means to an end, we're not loving them, we're actually using them. And so rather than seeing your neighbors with dignity and caring for them and loving them, the temptation is they become either projects or objects. Right? So they're a project, I just got to do my evangelistic duty, or they're just an object, someone that I'm sort of using to get whatever I want. But people were not made to be used, and we certainly should avoid that, particularly as Christians. So I think avoid fight the desire to just please people, but to realize that ultimately we're to please the Lord in loving others as He has loved us. And then also I would say with this, when you're trying to love somebody and they don't want to be loved, be faithful with what Christ has given you, not with what He hasn't given you. Right? So if He's given you the opportunity to befriend your neighbor, then by all means, take advantage of that. There's responsibilities with that. Lean into that. Don't walk away from it. Don't neglect it, but use that as that opportunity. But if they don't, then don't feel bad that God has not opened that door or presented you with that opportunity at that moment. And by the way, that's not a cop-out to say, don't say, well, I waved at my neighbor and they didn't wave back, so I'm being persecuted as a Christian, so I'm not going to. No, that's not what we mean by that, all right? This is over the long haul of an experience with someone, but to realize it may be that that's just not where you're at right now. Galatians chapter 6, verse 10, I don't know if you know this verse, but Paul says to do good to everyone, and then he adds the phrase, especially to those in the household of faith. You remember that verse there? But listen to what he says. He says, let us do good to everyone as we have opportunity. So Paul is leaving room for the sovereignty of God in loving your neighbor. That God might not have opened that door yet. That opportunity might have not have presented itself. So if there's not the opportunity, you don't have to bust down the door. I've got to love you because Jesus told me to love you, No, if they've not given you the opportunity, then consider that as a limitation and that God has not opened that door as of yet. Does any of you remember, it's really interesting to watch as time goes by, how fewer and fewer people know names. I don't know if the young people know. I know the older people. Do you remember the names? You remember D. James Kennedy?
Yes.
Do younger people know D. James Kennedy? I don't know. I hope. Yes, everybody should know the name D. James Kennedy. D. James Kennedy was a Presbyterian minister in Florida, if I remember correctly. He used to have this phrase, and I remember when I first heard it, and it's always stuck with me. He talked about looking for divine appointments. That phrase has stuck with me ever since I heard it. Divine appointments. That God's going to bring an opportunity that He's placed in front of you, right? And He's sovereignly put it there. Then you got to walk through that door if He opens that door. But if He hasn't given you that appointment, you don't have to feel like you got to force it and make it happen, but just be faithful with where you are. There's only so many hours in the day, so many days in the year, so many friendships you can have. You're not going to be able to show the same level of attention to every neighbor in your neighborhood. And so God might give you an opportunity in one season for this neighbor and maybe for this one and maybe never for this one. But that's okay. So that's the first. What do we do? Another thought here, limitation. What if the friendship isn't going anywhere? And by going anywhere, I mean they're not interested in the gospel. So again, they never come to church when you invite them. You've offered to bring them, and they just said, no, I'm not interested. I don't do that. They change the subject when you try to talk about Jesus. Well, I think this is a reminder to our first class. So here we go. We're going to go back in time. I should ask that question. Who remembers what the first class is? But remember that seeing your neighbor come to Christ is our ultimate desire, but it's not our only desire. Because loving our neighbors is part of a larger call that Christ has given to us. And so that's ultimately what we want, supremely what we want. But neighboring is more than just a means to the end of conversion. And sometimes loving a hard neighbor, now think about this, loving a difficult neighbor, that situation, it may not be about them. God might be using that for you. Right? It's easy to love people that love you back. Didn't Jesus talk about that somewhere? Even the Gentiles, right? Love the other Gentiles. Even tax collectors love other. But to love your enemies? Well, that's supernatural. That's something that only God can do. And so it may not be that person may never change. But God may be changing you in the process of showing love to someone that doesn't want to be loved. I also think, as we think about that it might not only be for you, right, this hard friendship, this hard relationship. Guess what? It might also be as a witness to the rest of the neighborhood. So don't just think in terms of this person needs Jesus, right? That person does need Jesus. But God may be doing something in you to teach you patience, to teach you grace, right? What's grace? Unmerited. Well, that they don't deserve. Well, let's all remember, none of us deserved, and yet that's the grace of Christ shown to us. And God needs to remind me of what I've received. But it also might be that other neighbors see this and go, man, he keeps cutting his lawn, and he's never said thank you. Why would a person do that? Why would a person continue to help them with their groceries when they've never even said a word to them? And it may be a witness. So there may be more going on in this than what you see with the person that you're talking to. So think about the fact that even if it's not going anywhere, it might actually be going somewhere in a different kind of way. So if your friendships with many of your neighbors is just a polite acquaintance, I think that's okay. You're not always going to have someone that is a full project, but I would say make sure that you do what you can. All right, limitation number 3, what if they don't like me? All right, what if I've tried and we've got some kind of thing, but they just don't like me? Okay, here's the interesting part. You rarely get to pick your neighbors. Right, isn't that true? It's like a college dorm, right? Did you pick your roommate? You did not. She was assigned to join you, right? And so sometimes you don't get the choice of who's there. I have to tell you a story. This is totally not spiritual, but I saw this story recently. Just reminded me of how neighbors can sometimes. I saw a story the other day of two neighbors where their neighborhood was really close together, like 5 feet from one yard to the next, and a fence right really close. And this one, I don't know, creepy neighbor had put up like a camera, like an outside camera, but it was on the back of his house, or like the side of his house, and it was facing the back of this neighbor's house, right? And he'd apparently gone and said, hey, why do you need a camera? Right? It's not like he has a big yard or something. It was clearly like painted at their house. And the guy didn't take it down, so they had this like picket fence, And so the guy, the picture, you have to go Google it, he put up one board that was like 20 feet tall right in front of the camera to block it from looking on the back. I'm not recommending that. I'm just saying sometimes you'll get a neighbor that you just don't get along, right? Even if you're polite and even if you're nice. Hopefully that won't happen to you. So what do you do if that is the case? So I think maybe if you're in Romans or close to it, I know I mentioned that. Look again in Romans chapter 12. Go down to verse 17. The Apostle Paul writes, never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Okay, well, I think we get that. If your neighbor is downright evil, is downright mean, is downright cruel, Don't respond in kind. We respond in grace. But then notice this next sentence here. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. So think about not only just what is this neighbor going to see, but as we said, what are the other neighbors going to see? Right? What is going to encourage the neighborhood? Like what's going to be good for those around me? And what are the things that I can do in that way? And then I'm also reminded 1 Thessalonians 2, Paul writes about the fact that we are to be righteous and blameless in our conduct towards others. And so I think that word is a good word to think about when it comes to a difficult neighbor. Ask yourself, am I blameless in this relationship? Not perfect, right? None of us are going to be perfect. Sometimes we might get impatient with them. Sometimes we might have a difficult time. But am I blameless in this? And so I would say, encourage you, if you and the neighbor don't get along, examine your motives and consider, is there something on your end? Right? I hope that as Christians, all of us strive to make humility our first reaction to a person and to a situation, right? Even a difficult one, because that's the way of Christ. That's the mind of Christ. Let this mind be in you. And so it's like, stop and ask yourself, have I wronged this person? Have I maybe unintentionally upset this person? Is there something that I've done that has soured this relationship, right? Hopefully in our families, right, we're quick with, especially if you're raising kids, we're quick to apologize and say, I'm sorry, right? You teach kids, tell your brother you're sorry. I'm sorry, right? Even if you don't mean it, say it, right? Right. Hopefully as husbands and wives, we're modeling that for our kids. We're saying, apologizing, saying you're sorry, right? Within the church, hopefully, as brothers and sisters, we have that courage to look at it and say, I am really sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. And that's a regular thing that we would be willing and ready to do. But I have to tell you, outside of our families and our church, right, between Christians, that can be one of the most radical things you can possibly do, especially for an unbeliever, is as the Christian, dare I say, take the low road, high road, low road, whichever road it is, and to say, I am really sorry that what I said or what I did upset you or soured this relationship. Even if you're 10% responsible in this thing, right? And the 90% is there. But what do we do sometimes? They dig their heels in and we dig our heels in, right? I'm not going to go talk to her because you know what she said to me. But to make the first step, to make this first move, right, is that work of humility, is that act of grace, and God might use that to soften the other person's heart in your life. So, what's the bottom line with this part? The bottom line is this here, that ultimately it is God's opinion of us that matters and not the opinion of our neighbors. I'm not saying we shouldn't seek out a bad reputation. Certainly, we should have a good reputation. But ultimately, we should seek to please God and honor God in what we say and do. 1 Corinthians chapter, I have it listed here as 4, but I don't think it is 4. No, it's 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Look at verse 7. Now again, he is talking Christians to Christians, so I understand the context of this. But notice what he says here. Actually then, it is already a defeat for you that you have lawsuits with one another. Which, by the way, I don't know if you know, our Constitution says we won't sue each other as church members. That's actually in the Constitution because of this verse right here, that we should not sue each other. Why? Because look what he says here. Why not rather be wronged, and why not rather be defrauded? So there's something worse than just being taken advantage of or being hurt by someone, right? And so Paul says, be willing to give that up if necessary for the sake of the relationship and the friendship. So God's opinion is what matters more than anything else. And even if it means we're taking that more difficult pathway, it's the right and best thing to do. So that's a little bit about some of the limitations that we may face. Let's spend a few moments as we close out tonight talking about boundaries. And by boundaries, I mean here, what if the person just takes advantage of my Christian kindness, right? I mean, Christians are hopefully known for being generous and compassionate and kind, But we can also be known for being doormats if it's that the case. Is that wrong? Is that right? What would you do with this? I told you I got this material from another church. I kind of made it my own for this. And so they had a different example here, but I thought this was the way they were talking about it here. I thought was interesting. I was trying to think, what would this look like in our congregation, in our church? A few weeks ago, we talked about building margins into your life. I don't know if you remember that. We talked about sometimes we don't love our neighbors because we just don't have time, right? And sometimes you have to build into your life time to be able to just stand across the fence and talk to someone, or maybe go to their house or do something like that, or visit them. And I got to thinking about it. I thought one group in our church that probably deals with this sort of struggle, this issue the most, would be moms who stay at home. Because you're home, people think you're free and available, right? And you offer to say, hey, you're talking to your neighbor and they say, boy, I just got, news that I think, I might have cancer. I got to go see a doctor. And you say, oh, is there anything we do? And they say, yeah, I need somebody to watch my kids after school. And you say, oh, I'd love to do that. And, yeah, bring them on over. And they come on over and they stay. And then they pick up and you talk to them and, care for them. And then they say, this weekend I got to go see a counselor because I'm going through this. And you're going, well, yeah, you got the cancer and this. So, yeah, I'll watch your kids again. And then next thing you know, the next week goes by and they come and say, hey, my kids had such a great time over here. I've got to go out and see my mom. And you're thinking, well, she's got cancer and she's got to do counseling. So how could I not let her go see your mom? So sure, I'll watch him. And, the next week it happens again. And before you know it, you're now the free daycare service to this neighbor, right? And the connection with them is just to drop off the kids and pick up the kids. There's no real, meaningful, interaction there. So what do you do in that situation? Do you feel bad? I'm not a good Christian because I want to cut this off? Or what exactly is the case? Well, I think there's a sense in which we can ask ourselves this question: am I loving my neighbor or enabling them? Now, this can be hard to determine sometimes. And I think we should err on the side of sacrifice and care, even as Jesus did for us, as unmerited favor. But sometimes it may be that by doing this kind of thing, we're actually not helping them through the situation that they have. So establishing boundaries can be helpful. I'm reminded of 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. Do you remember the Apostle Paul? He says, he told the church, for even when we were with you, we would give you this command: if anyone is not willing to work, neither shall he eat. Okay? Now that's a little bit of tough love, right? But now think about that, right? Why would the Apostle Paul say that? Because Paul doesn't care about feeding the hungry, right? Are we going to accuse the Apostle Paul of that? He's not a very good Christian. No, I think Paul realized that they had all of us have a temptation towards idleness and laziness. And it might be enabling to someone, right? So you take them a meal and they go, oh, that lasagna was so good. And could you bring it? And you bring it again. And then next thing you know, you're the Friday night menu at their house, right? And you're just constantly doing that for them. Again, there may be a point at which you say, you know what, this is not actually helping them, right? The neighbor who comes over to talk about the marriage problems, right? So you listen and you give advice, and you give some input, and they keep coming over, and you keep coming over, you keep coming over, and you finally say, well, are you and your spouse, are you and your husband seeing a counselor? Well, no, I have you. Well, wait a minute, right? And so you think, well, I want to be a good Christian, listen, but it may be that they need to see a counselor, and you need to cut this off so that they can do the thing that they need to do to actually help them get them to where they should be. Now, that's not an easy call, and I'm not trying to make it sound like it is an easy call. It's the kind of thing that we need wisdom, we need prayer, talk with, Sunday school teachers, people around you in the church, explain the situation, like here's where this is why I feel. Again, I think this should be kind of a last resort and not a first call. Like don't decide this the first day you meet them. Well, there's a boundary going up, right? That's not a good idea. But if you feel like the person is taking advantage in that way, I think there is wisdom for yourself, wisdom for them, that it may be wise to establish some boundaries. It also, in doing this, the other reason for this is it might be limiting your ability to help other neighbors. Right? If all of your attention is on this one, right, because they're very, very needy, it may be that there are others that you should be caring for as well. So what do boundaries look like? I know this is incredibly difficult to say, but it's sometimes learning the art of saying no. Sometimes that is a loving thing to say. Now again, I'm not prescribing exactly when and where and how, and again, we're talking about kind of extreme situations, but you may know people like that the best thing to say is, no, like you need to deal with this way. We've talked about this, and urge them in a better or more wise direction. I think it's important to remember, though, as we talk about this, the goal is not doing this out of self-preservation, because we are called to sacrifice. We are called, but it should be out of love for them, and love for what's in their best interest, and love for what they truly need, and love for where they need to go, and making sure that you're doing that as well. So admonishing them may be the right thing and pointing them in a better direction. So, I told you at the beginning, we read a passage, Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 4. I was going to mention at the very, 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 very end. If you are loving a difficult neighbor and you find it hard and you're not sure what to do, I want you to think of this parable. The kingdom of God is like a man who casts seed upon the soil. And look what it says in verse 27. And he goes to bed at night and gets up by day, and the seed sprouts and grows. How? He himself does not know. The soil produces crops by itself, first the blade, then the head, then the mature grain in the head. But when the crop permits, he immediately puts the sickle in because the harvest has come. So our job in verse 26 is to cast the seed, right? To sow the love, and to know, verse 27, that we go home and we go to bed and go, okay, Lord, you've got to work in their heart. You've got to do something I can't do. And we trust God to be at work in them so that we can continue to love them, knowing that He will, in His timing, bring the increase.